Hi, this is just something I want to discuss. I kind of feel that the nature of how comedies are discussed kind of hurts them as a medium because the whole idea of like remembering comedies purely through catchphrases kind of dulls a lot of the more poignant moments. Like, for example, with One Foot in the Grave, there's a slightly ironic joke in Father Ted involving all the characters only really referring to it by its catchphrase, and that joke on its own kind of almost slightly misses the point of the overall joke, which is that the characters are missing the overall plots of the episodes because they're only focusing on the catchphrase. And the show probably doesn't really go into that aspect of things as deeply as it could have done. I kind of want to, because when I was watching One Foot in the Grave myself, because I bought a DVD box set a few years ago to kind of get around to watching it, kind of watching it all the way through, because I know there are a few shows, and there's actually quite a lot of interesting subplots that get forgotten in a lot of comedies because of the nature of the catchphrase situation. Well, when I was watching the pilot episode, I was getting quite into it because it's actually quite a poignant episode. Because the whole pilot episode is not actually trying to be comedic in the traditionally like laugh a minute sense. It's more kind of setting up the story of Victor Meldrew losing his job and his place in his life and all of the kind of things that gave him his identity, and as he kind of like tries to figure out what to like do with his life now that he's lost his purpose. And it's a very poignant episode. There's some genuinely funny moments, but are funny in a somewhat depressing way. Like when he's mentioning how he lost his job to a small box, and his friends are like, "Oh, what size was it?" He's like, "Well, it's about 2 inches by 4." What does it matter what size it? You know, that kind of thing, where it's funny, but it's also like echoing that sort of frustration that he's feeling at that moment. And then midway through the episode, my mum kind of walks in on me watching it and just blurts out, "I don't believe it!" And it completely spoils the whole mood of the episode. Especially because at no point in that pilot does Victor actually say that line. That episode only comes up later in the show. I mean, that catchphrase rather, but because the catchphrase is all people remember about the show, they miss all of the they kind of don't talk about the more poignant aspects of Victor's journey, like his struggle to fit into the society at the time and all the kind of things that cause genuine harm to him that he genuinely reacts quite bigly to, quite massively to. Like, at the end of the first season, for example, he loses his entire house while on holiday because of a series of ridiculous events that happen while he's gone. And of course, he has a massive breakdown, and it's such a brilliant moment because it's both kind of funny, but also it just ends with his wife bursting into tears because of the stress of the situation, and him finally calming down enough to comfort her. And it's like, you need room for pathos in comedy to give the characters room to breathe, to give them an anchor point for the actual jokes that they end up making with them. Otherwise, it kind of starts becoming a bit more meaningless. An example of that I want to discuss with that as well is the older show Rocko's Modern Life, because a lot of people really remember it as a very kind of funny show, and it is quite laugh a minute, but there's also a brilliant underbelly of dark satire that no one really talks about because they only really remember like the recycle song and things like that, but don't really consider a lot of the actual character arcs that happen throughout the show. Because the problem with that kind of a show is it only really got shown piecemeal on like was random episodes at random times. Didn't really get shown in any real order, but because of that, character arcs didn't really stand out. And when I watched it all at once in that way, it actually made clear there actually are character arcs in the show that are quite satisfying. Like Heifer, for example, it kind of comes across, if you don't really know the show, as just being the slovenly, lazy idiot. And while there's aspects of that, he's really more of a man-child who's kind of uh, not really able to get outside of his box very easily because society kind of gives him too many temptations. Like his whole arc involves like him trying multiple jobs that kind of fall flat. Then there's that one brilliant episode where he moves out completely on his own to try and get completely independent, but it kind of goes too far. And because of a toxic roommate and the fact that he hasn't really got any real resistance to the kind of idea of a toxic roommate because he's never really had that kind of independence to have to deal with that sort of thing before. He kind of allows the roommate to pull him into a sort of make him indulge in his worst behaviors. He gets lazier, he gets fatter, he gets more gluttonous, and he doesn't even get sleep even though he's trying to tell his roommate to let him get some sleep and he has to get to work in the morning. And because he can't get that rest that he needs, he can't focus on his job, his restaurant does so badly that it literally gets shut down by the health department and he has to... This is brilliantly devastating moment where he's like just walking home after just like it's just too much for him at that point. So he just kind of like is on the phone to his mother, talking about how great it is living on his own, but he completely dissociates. And there's a brilliant moment where he completely dissociates, where the phone snaps, and he's no longer talking to anyone, but his body starts walking on its own as he's still talking on the phone to his imagined mother, just rambling about how much he's loving living on his own, how great he's doing, while his body's dragging him through literally hell and high water to get him back home again. And it's just such a brilliant scene that's not discussed enough, because people only discuss the lighter moments in the show and like the more light-hearted aspects, but it's a literal dog-eat-dog world. It's a brilliant dark satire of capitalism in Rocko's Modern Life, because the characters are literally animals, and it actually uses the whole food chain idea to represent capitalism, because it's a literal dog-eat-dog world. Like, one of the first jokes of the whole show is very dark. It's a chicken getting a job at a restaurant, only to then become one of the kids' meals at the restaurant. And there's a brilliant, like, opening moment. And there's also little things like the shopping mall in the very second episode has a sign saying it's right in the middle of the O-Town National Park. So capitalism's gone so rampant in this world of O-Town that even the federal government can't stand up to it. Like, even places that are supposed to be protected are still being developed on. And it's just such, like, hard-hitting moments like that you don't really think about because you're just in the background. And it works so well, and like the reason Heifer's whole thing is so satisfying is because he does find a balance after that disastrous situation when he finally gets a job as a postal worker, and he's happy because he's able to live at home while still having an actual job, and it's a job he can do. It's simple enough he can kind of focus on it, and he has decent co-workers, and he's not completely on his own, so he has decent role models as well. And it's like that whole arc would not be as satisfying without the pathos of him completely crashing and burning. Similarly, you have Ed Bighead, the curmudgeonly neighbour, who's really not a bad guy. He's just being crushed by his terrible job and the fact that they don't respect him at all in his company. And there's a brilliant metaphor in the episode where he gets promoted at one point outside of his comfort zone because he's relying on the magic meatball to give him all the answers to questions that are actually, they start off at first generally being quite difficult questions. Like, the whole idea is management are stuck on a thing and they can't figure out how to resolve it. It's like a very complicated mathematical thing involving finance. When you look at the actual paper, you can actually, if you look at it as an adult, you can actually understand some of the words it's using and kind of get the gist of what question it's asking. But none of the bosses can figure it out. And because Ed Bighead kind of cheats to get the answer from the meatball, he kind of keeps getting promoted because he keeps getting right answers and stuff by accident, but he's not learning anything. And because of that, he has this brilliant moment where as he's going up the ladder, which is kind of a literal like elevator going higher and higher in the building, he's not only getting more isolated to the extent that by the end of the episode, he's literally like in space with nothing else around him. He has no one to lean on, no one to help him. And he's become so detached from the office itself that he's asked the simplest possible question. Do we give the employees more parking, yes or no? And he can't answer the most basic possible question because he's just stuck in his rut, because he's been promoted so far out of his competency zone that he's crashed and burned completely. And it gets so bad he has a complete mental breakdown by the end of the show and has to have his wife literally bail him out as she takes over his job while he's having basically medical leave at home, having a mental health day, as she takes over at work and basically makes things just better by not kowtowing to his bosses. And it's such a great arc for the character, and it's just these moments that aren't really discussed because catchphrase culture only really brings up the stuff that's actively funny in the moment. And it's also it also affects other more poignant comedies that aren't trying necessarily to be laugh a minute, but still have really interesting stories to tell, like The Croods, for example. The second movie is certainly far funnier than the first, but I still respect the first movie because it tells a really great story about a character refusing to let go and learning the hard way how to deal with his feelings of of like possessiveness of his family. And it's a brilliant arc with the character because it continued in the second movie. Because by the second movie, he's expanded his whole idea of his pack to include not just Guy, but anyone else he ends up meeting. Like, even by the time you can tell here, probably in his arc, because by the time he meets Mr. Betterman, and he's kind of like a bit delirious in the sauna, and he's kind of trying to drag information out of him, he tells him actively, "I don't like you." And that's kind of like a very him thing to say, but he also mentions, but that's just because I don't know you very well. Maybe I need to give you a bit more time. And it's like, Greg realizes he doesn't like Mr. Betterman, but that's because he doesn't know him. And he didn't like Guy at first, but he got to know him, so maybe he's thinking, if I get to know Mr. Betterman, that's his arc from the first movie, continuing in the second. But in the second movie, in the first movie, his arc has a really brilliant moment that people don't really discuss because the first movie doesn't really get really much much attention because it's not laugh a minute like the second movie is. And it's got this brilliant moment where after he finally kind of finally lets his family go, finally learns his lesson at the end of the movie and literally throws them away to their safety as Pangaea is collapsing underneath his feet. The collapse of Pangaea does a brilliantly cool thing, and it forces him back into a cave. It's almost like the world itself is saying, "What? Isn't this what you wanted the whole time?" And it's a brilliant moment that really kind of hits him where it hurts, because suddenly he has to learn, show all the lessons he's learned as he kind of takes the giant death cat under his wing, because he realizes the death cat's just as scared as he is. And as he's finding his way out of the situation, literally riding the sun by the end of it, he's not only saving the cat, but he's also expanding his pack rapidly to include everything he sees, every animal he sees on the way that's in danger, he snatches up. And that's his arc really kind of rapidly coming into focus as he realizes, my pack isn't just my immediate family, it's anyone I care about. And it's such a great idea for his arc. And that's where I feel like and also the whole idea of the whole discourse as well, it also affects trailers as well. Because the whole idea of the internet only really remembering the funniest aspects of movies, it means people try and cram too much into trailers. Trailers that give up so much of the information of the movie itself. Like, for example, with the worst example of that was when I saw the Migration trailer, the new Illumination movie, and it showed every scene with the French chef. It didn't need to show that. All it needed to show was the intro of the chef and his crony chefs, because that was kind of a cool shot. And then the whole setup of him obsessing over his main dish of duck à l'orange, and the main duck being all, "What's that?" And the other guy being all like, "It's duck. It's you. With l'orange on top." That's a good line to end the trailer on. But they go too far with it and show every single instance of the l'orange joke, beating you so hard over it that you even end up seeing how they defeat the chef at the end of the movie, and it makes it completely pointless to even see the movie. And then Storks is a similar problem where it kind of, even though I really enjoyed the Storks movie, the trailer really gave away too much, because the whole thing with the glass labyrinth, that's not the original joke. The glass labyrinth is actually a payoff to a much earlier joke that would have worked better in the trailer, because the joke has a rapid setup and punchline, where it's his boss inviting him into his glass office and being all like, "Do you know why I made my office out of glass even though birds can't see glass?" Bird slams into the wall. Power move. That's a very funny moment. And it's a brilliant 30-second joke that would work perfectly in the trailer without giving away the ending of the movie. But because they kind of can't help themselves, they kind of show the payoff to the joke far too early. So it doesn't really give you much to look forward to, because you already know where it's going to go. And there's also a brilliant bit of visual narrative that Storks does that people may not even notice, because there's this whole thing where, as the movie goes on, the main kid and his parents are kind of doing a bonding exercise where, and over time, of course, it starts off with the father and the mother gets involved, because it's kind of like a gradual process of him trying to get his parents more involved in his life, because he's feeling left out, and that's why he even asked for a brother in the first place, because he wants someone to look after and someone to have time with, because his parents are too busy. But as his parents and him are bonding, they're actually remodeling the house into effectively a Stork beacon. And the brilliance of that visual thing is, at the end of the movie, when the baby factory is in full swing, there's a very strong visual similarity between the completed Stork beacon, designed by a literal child, and the factory itself, which is basically the beacon writ large, with all the aspects that the beacon has, kind of blown up into a ridiculous magical nonsense that works perfectly, because the whole idea, it gives a great idea that compared to the corporate Amazon warehouse thing that Storks have been doing, the original Baby Factory kind of like, it gives the idea that maybe it was kind of powered by the imagination of children itself, because of the fact that it has that visual theming with the Stork beacon. And it's stuff like that that I feel gets lost in a lot of comedies, because people aren't really thinking about anything other than, is it funny? Which is a very kind of diminutive way of looking at things. Like, a lot of my favourite comedies tend to be more poignant ones, like Stranger Than Fiction, for example, has funny moments, but it's overall kind of a, sort of a, not quite depressing, but the kind of depressive comedy, because of that kind of, it's about the nature of life and death and narrative storytelling. But it's still a comedy, and as a character puts it, that's kind of how I see comedy versus tragedy in the Greek sense, because it gives me more of a wider spectrum to look at comedies under, rather than is it funny or whatever. I just think, is it a comedy in the Greek sense, in that, comedy you get hit, tragedy you die. Is it one in which the characters end by getting what they're after a struggle? Because that is, of course, the sort of standard narrative framing of a comedy. And I feel that focusing too much on the jokes on their own, it means that the more interesting aspects of the story completely get thrown by the wayside, because no one's really thinking about them, or really willing to engage in that aspect of things, because they're just kind of focusing on the easily catchphrase jokes, like, oh, I liked it when this character said this one thing, or it was funny when he hit the glass a million times. That they're only really thinking of the stuff that made them actively laugh. And they're not really thinking about, like, the more poignant aspects, which is why a lot of more recent comedies have done so much better than others, because they're very willing to go to those places and earn the audience's respect. Like with Puss in Boots, for example, its newest movie, having the whole thing about panic attacks, and even Adam Sandler's Leo having, like, a lot of aspects of, like, Leo's, like, self-consciousness about his potential end of his life coming up. That's a very interesting idea. And it's like, I feel a lot of comedies get short shrift in the actual discussion, because people are only focusing on the immediate funny jokes, or the more popular comedies. And so a lot of comedies that don't meet the current standard of, is there a joke every 5 seconds, and is it making me laugh every 5 seconds, they're falling by the wayside and becoming kind of underrated, which is a massive shame. I just want to mention that, because I really feel passionate about this aspect of media, and about, like, the nature of comedies in general, and being able to take a narrative seriously enough to engage with what it's actually saying, while also enjoying the jokes that come out of it. Because it also means that if a joke falls flat in the comedy, it still doesn't matter as much, because the poignancy is keeping you engaged. Like the whole sequence in The Croods, where, in the first one, where Nicolas Cage's character is doing the whole kind of forcing ideas, it's kind of cringy and a little bit of an annoying scene, is my least favourite scene in the movie, because it's trying too hard to be funny. But I stick with it, because the character has such a strong arc. But yeah, that's just all I want to say about that, so thank you for listening, and have a nice day.